They said Lancaster County was built on honest soil, but in 1837, 4 men died so suddenly, so strangely, that even death itself seemed to bow before the will of 4 women. An attorney broken on the roadside, a banker drowned in water too shallow to claim a man's life, a judge poisoned by invisible sickness, and a sheriff found rotting at the bottom of his own well. 4 pillars of the county erased one by one, leaving only whispers and widows. And here is the secret no one dares speak aloud. All 4 men had married into the same family. 4 sisters, 4 husbands, 4 graves. Where are you right now as you hear this? What time is it where you sit, listening? Answer me, because time matters here. Time always mattered to them. The Brennan sisters, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah, were not born killers. They were forged by hunger, by memory, by the cold grip of inheritance laws written by men who never thought women would fight back. Their father, Patrick Brennan, had clawed his way from Irish exile to American wealth. His farm was not just land, it was defiance, a monument carved against centuries of English landlords who had stripped his people bare. To lose that soil was to lose their bloodline, and so when Patrick fell to death's hand in 1836, his daughters did not merely weep, they gathered by candlelight in the stone farmhouse, frost on the windows, silence pressed heavy in the room. 4 shadows, 1 oath. We stay together, Bridget said, her voice as sharp as the blade she would later hide in her apron. The law will divide us, Margaret whispered, ever practical. The law, Catherine answered, her eyes glinting in the lamplight, is only another man waiting to be persuaded. And then Sarah, the youngest, the voice like honey over steel, breathed the words that damned them all. Men die, sisters, husbands die, and widows inherit everything. At night, the fire in the hearth cracked like a warning, but none of them heard. They had already stepped beyond the line, already tasted the first drop of forbidden power. When Bridget married Thomas Hennessy, Lancaster's most respected attorney, the town celebrated. They thought it was a union of fortune and love, a widow and a land-rich woman binding their lives together. But in the farmhouse kitchen, the sisters saw only strategy. Hennessy would secure the farm's debts, bend the law, and silence questions. He thought he had gained a wife. What he truly gained was a noose tightening around his neck. On March 15, 1838, Thomas Hennessy fell from his horse on a fog-drenched morning road. The newspapers called it accident, but the bruises on his skull told another story. His widow, Bridget, wept in public. At home, she counted deeds and coins, and Lancaster County began to whisper. 1 death, perhaps misfortune. 2, a curse. But 4 men of power, stripped from life in the span of 4 years, each bound by wedding rings to the same bloodline. That was no curse, that was conspiracy. Tell me, would you have done differently? If everything your father bled for stood ready to be stolen by law, scattered by courts, eaten by creditors, would you not hold the knife yourself? Would you not learn to smile as poison stirred in the cup? Because the Brennan sisters did, and once the first body was lowered into the earth, they discovered a truth darker than soil, that murder, once tasted, is easier the second time. And Lancaster County, with its hymns and Sunday prayers, had no idea that its most fertile farm was watered not just by Mill Creek, but by blood. The funeral bells for Thomas Hennessy had barely stopped echoing when the second act of the sisters' design began. Grief cloaked Bridget like a veil, her tears public, her mourning dress black as coal. But behind closed doors, in the farmhouse where secrets rooted deeper than any oak, there was no mourning, only calculation. It was Catherine's turn now. She had the gift of sight, not the kind sung of in Holy Scripture, but the kind that saw through men like glass. She could weigh ambition against fear in a single glance, taste greed in a handshake, feel loneliness radiating like heat from a man's chest. And in 1838, loneliness was the crack she pried open. His name was Elias Thornton, president of the Lancaster Bank. A man with silver hair and trembling hands, but more importantly, control over money that could either drown the Brennan farm or raise it higher than before. Catherine made herself his remedy, her voice a balm, her presence a cure. She poured herself into the empty glass of his heart until he believed her to be necessity itself. Within a year, they were married. The county gossips whispered that Thornton had won himself a jewel, but the farmhouse whispered something else, that another man had been chained to their survival. Only this time, the plan required more than inheritance. The banker carried insurance policies, written in neat ledgers, promising wealth upon his death. And so the sisters schemed, not with knives or accidents, but with the element no coroner could ever trap in ink: water. The night of his death was fog-bound, just as it had been for Hennessy. Elias Thornton was found face down in Mill Creek, his fine wool coat heavy with water, his lungs filled with mud and silt. The current was shallow, no deeper than a man's boot, yet they said he drowned. The official report called it misstep, bad footing, an old man lost in the mist, but those wapiti patigaon. Who saw his body noticed the bruises on his wrists, as though gripped tight. Catherine wept convincingly. The townspeople pitied her, praising her strength, speaking of cruel fate. But in the stone farmhouse, as the deed of his properties passed into her hands, she laid the papers beside Bridget's growing collection. The land was safe for now, the family fortress remained unbroken. Yet Lancaster was not blind. 2 men of prominence dead in 2 years, both tied to the Brennan women. Coincidence strained thin. At taverns, whispers grew. At church pews, eyes lingered too long on veiled faces. The sisters knew, and it was Margaret, with her angelic beauty masking a ruthless heart, who reminded them of the rule that bound their conspiracy: to stay together, always. One sister faltered, all would fall. It was then that something shifted. What began as a pact of survival had become a hunger. Land, wealth, power. They had tasted control, and it was intoxicating. The farm was no longer just their father's legacy, it was their kingdom. But kingdoms are not held by law alone, they are held by blood. I ask you, as you sit in your own time and place, what would you sacrifice to hold power? Would you let the earth swallow men who trusted you, if it meant the soil beneath your feet remained yours forever? The Brennan sisters did not hesitate, and soon Lancaster would learn that the banker's death was not the end. It was only the second stone laid on a road that led deeper into shadow, because the third sister was waiting, and her turn would be crueler still. By the harvest of 1839, Lancaster's whispers had become a low, steady hum. 2 husbands dead, 2 widows left with property untouched and wealth expanding like vines. Yet society has always been blind when beauty stands at the center, and Margaret Brennan understood this more than anyone. She was the sister men could not look away from. Hair like woven copper, eyes that seemed lit from within, a face so delicate that even old men found themselves speaking softer in her presence. But beneath that softness lay the sharpest steel. Margaret was not content with mere survival. She craved elevation, prestige, a name carved into the higher walls of Pennsylvania's power. And she knew exactly where to find it. His name was Judge William Harrow, 53 years old, stern, respected, a man whose verdicts carried weight across the county. He had the ear of politicians, the loyalty of sheriffs, the reverence of clerks. Marrying him would not just protect the Brennan farm, it would shield the sisters with the law itself. Margaret made it seem natural, a chance meeting at Sunday Mass, a gentle conversation after court, a hand brushing his sleeve in a way that sent blood rushing to a man who thought himself long past such weakness. Within 6 months, the judge was smitten. Within a year, he was hers. The farmhouse rejoiced, not with laughter, but with relief, for if a judge could be bent into family, no prosecutor would dare pursue whispers, no coroner would sharpen suspicions. Lancaster itself seemed to quiet, believing fate had blessed the sisters once again. But fate does not bless, fate tempts. By autumn of 1840, Judge Harrow fell ill. At first it was dismissed as a seasonal fever, the kind that swept through farms with the turning leaves. But his sickness deepened, night sweats, violent vomiting, a slow wasting that left his once powerful frame skeletal. Physicians bled him, dosed him with mercury, applied poultices. Nothing worked, and Margaret, his young bride, never left his side, feeding him, praying beside him, her angelic face framed by candlelight. What no physician could see was the powder stirred into his wine, the tinctures slipped into his broth, the steady dosing of arsenic that transformed the judge's body into a prison of agony. Margaret smiled through his screams, playing the role of the faithful wife, while in the kitchen her sisters kept count of the days. When he died, the county wept. A judge taken too soon, claimed by mysterious illness. Margaret wore black, her beauty made sharper by grief, her mourning performance flawless. Lancaster believed her a saint of sorrow, But in the farmhouse, as the will was read, she laid another deed beside Bridget's and Catherine's, the land secure, the sisters' empire unshaken, 3 husbands, 3 deaths, 3 widows, and still, no hand of justice moved against them, because power had been silenced, because beauty concealed rot, because men, blinded by desire and ambition, could not imagine that women, soft and smiling, could wield murder as easily as needle and thread. But Lancaster's silence was not peace. Whispers had turned to fear. Neighbours avoided the farm after dusk. Mothers pulled their sons away from the Brennan daughters. And beneath the unease was a question that no one dared ask aloud. If the judge could fall, who among them was safe? The sisters had learned something their father never taught them. That land is not the only thing worth owning. Fear itself could be inheritance. Fear could guard them as well as any wall. Tell me, do you feel it yet? That pull in your chest, that shiver in your spine, as if the ground beneath you shifts, because you are not merely hearing their story, you are stepping into it, and once you step in, you do not come out unchanged. But remember, there was still one sister left, and her crime would be the darkest of all. By the winter of 1841, Lancaster County had become a stage set for dread. 3 powerful men gone in the span of 3 years. 3 Brennan sisters draped in black lace, each richer, each more untouchable than before. The town whispered of curses, of God's punishment, of something unnatural flowing from that stone farmhouse on the pike, but none dared speak the word that sat on every tongue: murder. The youngest, Sarah, had been quiet through it all. Sweet Sarah, gentle Sarah, the one with the voice that could melt even the sternest resolve. To outsiders, she was innocence untouched by her sister's cold ambition, but those who lived beneath that roof knew differently, for Sarah was not the weakest link, she was the most dangerous of them all. Unlike her sisters, Sarah did not crave power or wealth, she craved something deeper, devotion, to be worshipped, to be the very centre of a man's world, and when she found such devotion in Sheriff Matthew Callahan, she saw not just a husband, but the final piece to seal the sisters' dominion. The sheriff was not a man of subtlety, he was strength, blunt and iron-bound, sworn to uphold law and order in a county now trembling under rumour. To marry him was to place the law itself under the sisters' roof. Who would accuse them when the very man sworn to investigate crime shared their table? Who would question them when his badge glinted in the farmhouse light? Their wedding was the most celebrated of them all. Farmers raised their glasses, townsmen cheered, and Lancaster allowed itself the comfort of believing tragedy was behind the Brennans. 4 sisters, now all secure, 4 husbands. But beneath the joy, suspicion lingered like a shadow that could not be shaken, and shadows do not rest. For by autumn of that same year, the sheriff was gone, his body pulled from the stone well behind his own house, his skull cracked, his lungs full of stagnant water. The verdict? Misstep, an accident in the dark, but those who knew Wells knew better. The sheriff had been a man of steady footing, broad shoulders and sharp instinct. Men like him do not simply fall. At his funeral, Sarah wept so violently she collapsed against the coffin, but her sisters, behind their veils, exchanged only the faintest of glances. 4 sisters, 4 husbands, 4 deaths, and now, the farm, the land, the wealth, all safe, all theirs, bound together by blood and widowhood. Do you see it now? Do you understand the brilliance and the horror of their design? They had found the one loophole in the system that sought to scatter them. They had used the very structures of inheritance, law, and marriage against the men who built them. They had turned society itself into a weapon. But Lancaster County was not blind anymore. Fear had become certainty. The townspeople whispered not of curses now, but of witches. They spoke of poison in the bread, spells in the candle smoke, evil that wore the faces of angels. The Brennan farm became a fortress of silence. Neighbours crossed the road rather than walk near its fields. Mothers prayed when they heard the sisters' names, and yet, no jury was ever called. No trial was ever held, because what man could accuse them without condemning himself for his blindness? What priest would name them guilty without admitting that beauty had led him astray? What sheriff could bring them to justice when the last one had died in their shadow? Now I ask you, what do you see when you look at the world around you? Do you see law as protection, or do you see what the Brennan sisters saw, that every system, every statute, every rule, is only a wall waiting for someone ruthless enough to climb over it? Comment this phrase twice, to mark the point of no return, to lock yourself into this descent. Men die. sister, inherit. Because from here, the story does not rise into the light, it falls deeper into the chambers where truth is buried alive. After Sheriff Callahan's body was pulled from the black water of that well, Lancaster County did not return to peace. It could not. 4 men of stature gone, each bound by ring and vow to the Brennan name. The county's pillars had crumbled, and the farmhouse on the pike loomed like a fortress built not from stone, but from silence. The people whispered, yes, but whispers are weak when bound by fear, and fear had become the sisters' greatest inheritance. Men who once boasted in taverns grew hushed at the sight of them. Women who once envied their beauty now crossed the street to avoid their eyes. Priests thundered from pulpits about sin and God's judgment, yet not one dared name them directly. Because the Brennans had outmaneuvered more than husbands, they had conquered the very will of the county. But here is the truth that history hides. It was never just about the land. That was the beginning, yes, the spark. But by the time the sheriff lay cold in the ground, the sisters had tasted something far greater than soil. They had tasted control, to bend the law with a smile, to make powerful men kneel not with chains but with vows, to reshape fate with their own hands, and watch the county bow in submission. You see, survival is a fire. Once lit, it burns until there is nothing left but hunger. And the sisters, each in her way, had become creatures of hunger. Bridget, the strategist, measured their gains with ink and coin, stacking security against the fear of loss. Catherine, the reader of souls, looked into the eyes of Lancaster's leaders and saw only weakness to exploit. Margaret, the angel-faced serpent, learned that grief made her more desirable than beauty ever could. And Sarah, the gentle voice, discovered that the law itself was fragile enough to be drowned in a well, but power won through blood is never without cost. With every husband buried, with every funeral veil lifted, a piece of the sisters darkened. The farmhouse was silent at night, its hearths burning but its halls colder than winter. No laughter, no music, only the scratching of pens, the counting of deeds, the rehearsing of lies. They had become widows, yes, but also wardens of their own design. And Lancaster itself was changing. Fear twisted into stories. Farmers told their children not to wander near Mill Creek lest the widows take them. Old women muttered that the Brennan girls had made pacts with something unholy, that their father's land had been consecrated not with sweat but with sacrifice. Some claimed to see lights flickering in the fields at night, shadows moving where no man walked. Were these truth, or just the fevered tales of a county choking on its own silence? No one knew, but everyone believed. What no one saw, what no one dared see, was that the sisters had discovered the most forbidden secret of all. That the systems men build to rule others are not sacred. They are levers, and levers can be pulled by anyone willing to pay the price. Do you understand now why their story was buried? Why courthouse records whisper only half the truth? Because if men knew, if you knew, that power was not reserved for judges or sheriffs or bankers, but could be seized by those cunning enough to grasp it, what would stop you from reaching for it yourself? The Brennan sisters walked into that forbidden knowledge without hesitation, and once they crossed that threshold, Lancaster County was never the same. But the question remains, were the sisters simply murderers, or had they become something far more dangerous, something that could not be tried, could not be hanged, could not be silenced, something that still lingers? And if fear itself can become an inheritance, then perhaps their story is not finished, not yet. By 1842, Lancaster County was rotting beneath its own silence. 4 deaths, 4 widows, and still no hand of law had dared move against the Brennans. The courthouse records, the physician's reports, the coroner's notes, all neatly written, all officially sealed, all whispering, accident, illness, misstep. Paper lies, stacked to the ceiling. But the people of Lancaster were not fools. They knew, everyone knew. And yet, nothing happened. Do you see the weight of that? 4 men of power dead and still no justice. Why? Because those who could accuse were trapped by their own weakness. The attorney's colleagues had prospered under Bridget's careful hand. The banker's rivals now owed debts to Catherine's smile. The judge's peers refused to admit they had been blinded by Margaret's tears. And the sheriff's deputies, left leaderless, feared their own names might be added to the ledger of graves. This is the truth men rarely admit aloud. Institutions do not protect you. They protect themselves. And when corruption seeps in like water under a door, the walls do not collapse. They simply shift, silently, to accommodate the rot. The Brennans understood this. They had not just killed men, they had exposed the fragility of power itself. They had revealed how fear and silence can wrap tighter than rope, how manipulation can weigh heavier than iron. Lancaster County became their mirror, reflecting every weakness of its rulers back at them. And what of the sisters themselves? Did guilt gnaw at them in the quiet hours of night? No, if anything, they grew harder, sharper. Bridget, once merely a daughter desperate to keep her father's farm, now kept ledgers of wealth greater than most townships. Catherine, the reader of hearts, began to shape not just men but whole gatherings, controlling rooms with a glance, making decisions seem like they had come from others' mouths, not her own. Margaret, draped in black silk, discovered the magnetic power of mourning, how men rushed to console her, how women sought her counsel, how grief had become her throne. And Sarah, the youngest, the innocent, learned to wield her sorrow like a dagger, her soft voice breaking even the hardest resolve. Together, they became something more than sisters. They became an institution unto themselves, a power greater than the bank, the court, or the sheriff's badge. 4 women who, by all rights, should have been scattered by law, yet instead had twisted law into their servant. But every rise carries a shadow, and the shadow stalking them was not Lancaster's whispers, it was memory. For men forget quickly, institutions bury their own sins, but the land remembers. Soil watered with fear does not simply grow corn and cattle, it grows stories. Neighbors swore they heard voices across the fields at night, long after the sisters had gone to bed. Lamps burned in windows until dawn, yet no one entered or left. Animals shied at the edges of the farm, refusing to cross the fences. Mill Creek, once a place of children's laughter, became a place of silence. The water dark, the stones colder than elsewhere. The Brennans ignored it all. They had to, because to admit it was to admit the weight of what they had done. But Lancaster saw, Lancaster whispered, Lancaster knew that the Brennan sisters had not just broken men, they had broken the balance. And here is where you must ask yourself, what balance do you think holds your world together? Laws, religion, the promises of leaders? Or are those things too only illusions, walls that crumble when touched by hands ruthless enough to press against them? The sisters had learned the answer. They had learned that the balance was a lie, and they had learned it too late to ever go back. And still, their descent was not finished. The worst way is yet to come. By 1843, the Brennan farm stood larger and richer than ever, its barns heavy with grain, its cattle fattened, its fences stretching across acres of envy. 4 women ruled it, widows cloaked in black, feared yet untouchable. But wealth and fear are never quiet companions. They breed questions, they breed resentment, they breed obsession, and Lancaster County had begun to obsess over the sisters. You see, when power becomes too absolute, it draws not just envy but scrutiny. The townspeople, though silent, were not blind. They noticed patterns, they whispered names, they traced dates, 4 weddings, 4 funerals, 4 inheritances. And in the taverns at night, men leaned closer, lowering their voices, speaking the thought that had become impossible to ignore. They killed them. But whispers, no matter how sharp, cannot cut without proof, and proof had been carefully buried. Papers signed, physicians bribed or blinded, witnesses lulled into silence. The Brennans were not careless, they were deliberate. Still, suspicion clung to them like smoke, and suspicion attracts hunters. One such hunter was a traveling minister from Philadelphia, Reverend Elias Ward. He was no fool. He had heard the rumors before he ever stepped into Lancaster. To him, the Brennan story was not tragedy, it was temptation, a tale too dark, too perfect, too damning to ignore. He arrived with sermons dripping fire, thundering about Jezebels, about women who consorted with darkness, about widows who fed upon the souls of men. His eyes sought the sisters in the pews, his voice rose sharper when their veils lowered. At first, the county welcomed his words. Finally, someone speaking what they dared not. But the Brennans did not tremble. They sat in the stone farmhouse, listening as their neighbors whispered of witchcraft, as Ward declared them agents of corruption. And when Bridget finally spoke, her words cut colder than any blade. Preachers come and go, land remains. The sisters understood something Ward did not, that Lancaster's fear was not yet enough to act. For action requires more than suspicion, it requires sacrifice. Who among them would stand first, would accuse, would risk everything if the sisters were acquitted? Who would dare testify when 3 judges had already turned blind eyes, when the sheriff himself had drowned under their shadow? Ward tried. Oh, he thundered. He visited neighbors, demanded inquiries, begged magistrates, but the county had no appetite for battle with 4 widows who owned more land, more cattle, and more silence than anyone else. Lancaster turned its back on him, and when Ward left, broken and bitter, the sisters had won again. But victory does not erase danger, it only deepens paranoia. From then on, the Brennans tightened their circle. Fewer visitors, fewer outings, their once lavish appearances grew rare. They became phantoms haunting their own land, seen only at market or mass, their black dresses like omens drifting through the crowd. And Lancaster, though outwardly calm, grew more restless in its silence. Children dared each other to creep close to the farmhouse gates at night. Farmers swore they saw figures moving in the fields where no lantern burned. And every story, every rumor, every whisper gave the sisters more power, not less. For in fear, they found their throne. Tell me, what happens when fear itself becomes currency, when silence is worth more than gold? The Brennans knew, they wielded it, they thrived on it. And yet, beneath the triumph, beneath the iron discipline, something began to crack. Not outside, inside, because fear, once unleashed, cannot be controlled forever. It consumes not just neighbors, but its masters. And in the farmhouse on the pike, the sisters were beginning to feel its hunger. The year 1844 dragged across Lancaster like a winter that would not end. Outwardly, the Brennan sisters stood unbroken, wealth secure, land intact, their veiled figures still untouchable. But inside the stone farmhouse, something darker than grief, darker than ambition, had begun to coil through the halls. They had bound themselves together with an oath. We stay together, whatever it takes. And for years that oath had been their strength. But oaths are iron chains, and chains do not just bind, they choke. It began with silence at the dinner table. Bridget, once the sharp voice of strategy, now spoke little, her pen scratching late into the night as she counted and recounted the ledgers. Catherine, who once charmed and read men like open books, turned her gift inward, her eyes narrowing at her own sisters, searching for weakness. Margaret's beauty, sharpened by her role as grieving widow, began to sour. She caught her reflection in the glass and saw not an angel, but a predator draped in black. And Sarah, the youngest, once the softest, grew restless, her voice sharpened, her laughter too loud in the empty halls. They had survived Lancaster's suspicion, outmaneuvered judges, defied priests, buried 4 husbands. Yet they could not escape the creeping realization that their greatest enemy was no longer outside. It was within. Because power, once taken, must be guarded, and to guard it is to suspect betrayal at every turn. Bridget kept the keys to the lockbox under her pillow. Catherine demanded to read every letter before it left the farmhouse. Margaret accused Sarah of speaking too freely at market, her careless chatter stirring more whispers. Sarah mocked Margaret's vanity, saying her mourning dress was tighter than her conscience. Small fractures, small words. But in silence, fractures widen. The land thrived under their rule, fields heavy with grain, cattle multi. Eye plying, barns bursting, yet the farmhouse itself grew heavy with something invisible, a presence, a weight, as if the very soil beneath them groaned under what had been buried. And still, Lancaster watched. By now, no one spoke the sisters' names without lowering their voice. Men crossed themselves when their shadows fell across the pike. Children swore they heard cries carried on the wind from Mill Creek at night. The Brennans were no longer women, they had become myth. Wives turned widows, widows turned legends. But myths are dangerous, myths grow larger than their makers, and the sisters, though feared, were also prisoners of the legend they had built. They could not remarry, not without undoing the chain of widows' inheritances. They could not separate, not without risking everything they had sworn to protect. They were bound, not by love, but by the blood-stained rope of necessity. And Lancaster whispered still. What did they do? How did they do it? When will they strike again? I ask you now, when you look at the world, do you believe power keeps you safe? Or does it only build higher walls around you, walls that trap you inside as surely as they keep others out? The Brennan sisters had built their fortress of blood and law, but now, inside its walls, they found no peace, only suspicion, only silence, only the creeping realization that they had not conquered Lancaster. They had only imprisoned themselves within it. By 1845, the Brennan sisters were no longer simply women, nor merely widows. They had become something more terrible, a living secret Lancaster County carried like a disease. The farm thrived, yes. The wealth endured, but wealth cannot cure the weight of eyes. Everywhere they went, stares followed. Veils could hide their faces, but not the fear that clung to them like smoke. In town, men nodded politely but never lingered. Women whispered behind hands, voices trembling as if gossip itself could summon curses. Children dared each other to touch the Brennan gate at night, swearing the iron burned their fingers. And still the sisters walked with their heads high, their steps steady, as if fear itself were the cloak that kept them warm. But in the stone farmhouse, the air was poisoned, not with arsenic or laudanum, but with mistrust. 4 sisters bound together by an oath that now felt less like blood and more like chain. Bridget obsessed over accounts, her ink-stained fingers trembling with the fear of loss. Catherine's sharp eyes, once weapons, now turned inward, dissecting every gesture, every pause, every silence of her kin. Margaret, still wrapped in black, fed her vanity on grief, but her beauty was souring, curdling into something hollow, and Sarah, the youngest, grew restless, reckless, her laughter brittle, her charm laced with venom. Together they had defeated law, silenced priests, and broken Lancaster's strongest men. But what no one in town could see was that the sisters were unraveling, not because of enemies outside, but because of shadows within. For power devours not just those it crushes, but those who wield it. The farmhouse halls creaked with secrets. Doors closed quickly when footsteps passed. Conversations fell to whispers, then to silence. Rumors spread in town that the sisters no longer dined together, that their once solid unity had splintered into factions, alliances shifting like storm clouds, and yet none dared confront them, because by now their legend was no longer built on fact. It was built on fear. To accuse them was to risk disappearance, or worse, to join the list of names buried beneath their silence. Fear had made them untouchable. Fear had become their final inheritance. But here is the hidden truth. When fear becomes too complete, it ceases to protect, it isolates, it consumes. The sisters had walled themselves off so completely that even their victories turned to dust in their hands. They owned the land, but it felt empty. They had silenced Lancaster, but the silence became unbearable. They had buried 4 men, but in truth they had buried themselves alive. By 1846, Lancaster no longer waited for the sisters to strike. Instead, it simply withdrew. Families avoided the pike. Churches stopped sending invitations. Their farm fed the county, but no one thanked them. Their names faded from conversation, not because they were forgotten, but because speaking them aloud felt like an invocation of something unholy. And the sisters, trapped in their farmhouse of stone, became prisoners of their own myth. No law could touch them, no neighbor would confront them, but no one would love them either. They had gained everything they swore to protect, and lost everything that made it worth protecting. Tell me, do you see it now? The final cruelty of power, that it gives, yes, but only long enough to take more away. The Brennan sisters had mastered the art of inheritance, of manipulation, of blood. But power is a hunger without end, and in Lancaster County, hunger always leaves bones behind. And soon, their own bones would join the harvest. Listen closely, because this is the part they never wanted you to hear. The Brennan sisters did not die in fire, or rope, or prison cells. No, their punishment was slower, crueler, more insidious than the gallows. They lived long enough to see the very empire they killed to protect turn into a mausoleum of their own making. By the 1850s, the farm still stood, richer, more productive than ever, but the sisters were ghosts walking through it. Bridget, the iron-willed eldest, withered into a figure of paranoia, her hands trembling as she clutched ledgers like scripture, staring at numbers that mocked her with their emptiness. Catherine, once the master manipulator, fell into silence, her eyes deadened as though she could no longer read the desires of others, or perhaps she had read them all and found nothing but contempt. Margaret's beauty decayed into bitterness, her reflection a reminder of what charm had cost. Her vanity curdled into hate, and Sarah, the youngest, the boldest, grew restless to the point of madness, pacing the halls at night, whispering to walls, as if bargaining with the shadows of the men they had buried. The land was whole, yes, but the family was not. No husband, no children, no legacy beyond whispered curses. They had secured the farm, only to watch it become a fortress of isolation, their bloodline ending with them. By the 1860s, the Brennan sisters were old women, feared but untouched, locked in a cage they had built with their own hands. And then, as suddenly as their story began, it ended, not with screams but with silence. One by one, they were found in the farmhouse, sitting upright in their chairs, as if waiting for a guest who never came. No signs of violence, no illness recorded, just 4 women, lifeless in a room where the fire had burned out hours earlier. The coroner wrote it off as natural causes, but the town whispered another explanation, that the land itself, drenched in too much blood, had finally claimed what it was owed. The farm was seized, divided, sold off in parcels just as Patrick Brennan had once feared. Today, commuters drive past those fields without knowing the price that was paid to keep them whole, without knowing the pact 4 sisters once made by candlelight, that husbands would die and widows would inherit everything. But now you know, and that knowledge is not harmless, because once you see it, you begin to notice the pattern everywhere. Families who rise too quickly, fortunes that seem too perfect, dynasties built on the sudden deaths of those in the way. Do you really believe it stopped in 1837? Or do you sense even now that the same game plays out in boardrooms, in politics, in the quiet corners of power where accidents and illness strike with surgical precision? Tell me, brother, are you ready to look around your own world and see who is feasting on the lives of others? Are you ready to recognize how fear, inheritance, and control still move like invisible hands across your life? If you've stayed with me to the end, I want you to write these words in the comments below, to carve them into your mind like a mark of initiation. The land remembers, the blood collects. Write it twice and let it bind you to the truth no man can ever unhear. Because history is not just in books, it is alive, breathing, hunting, and sometimes it takes the shape of 4 sisters in Lancaster County whose crimes echo louder than any sermon, any law, any grave. Now you've heard it, you cannot go back, the descent is complete. The question is, what will you do with it?